Pleased to introduce our moderator, Professor Claire Finkelstein, who founded CERL in 2012 and has served as CERL's faculty director since its inception. She's the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Claire, to you.
Thank you so much, Dave. We have an incredible group of guests today to help us conduct this briefing. This will be our last briefing before we break for winter break, and we'll resume again on the 11th of January. Today we'll be talking about the situation of the hostages and discussing the situation of renewed, we hope, negotiations that will start to allow more hostages to be released and hopefully a new ceasefire. We're going to have our guests today in different groups. We're going to begin with two individuals, Ambassador John Limbert. During his 34-year career in the United States Foreign Service, Ambassador John Limbert served mostly in the Middle East and Islamic Africa, including at posts in Iran, Iraq, Sudan, Guinea, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, excuse me, and the United Arab Emirates. He was among the last American diplomats to serve at the American Embassy in Tehran. He was president of the American Foreign Service Association and ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. Called out of retirement in 2009 to 2010, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary responsible for Iranian affairs in the State Department's Bureau in Near East Affairs. Between 2017 and 2019, he served on the Foreign Service Grievance Board. After retiring from the State Department in 2006, he was class of 1955 Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the U.S. Naval Academy, where he taught courses in history and political science until retiring in 2018. He held the Bruce Lipper Fellowship in Middle East Policy at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. Today, he'll be joining us particularly because he was among the hostages held in the embassy, U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979. He was held for 14 months in captivity, and he'll be joining us to talk about his experience there. And I'm also delighted to introduce Avi Kalo. Avi will join us. Avi is, after retiring 3 years ago from the IDF, after 25 years at the Corps of Collection, Operation, and Analysis, hub of the Israeli intelligence community, in numerous management and command positions. Avi is serving with the IDF in the current war as active senior military reserve in the Northern Command. In his former position as head of MIA's Missing in Actions Department, Avi generated historic breakthroughs in operational methodologies and clandestine operations to repatriate IDF missing personnel. Avi headed the National Negotiating Hostage Team with respect to Hamas, working closely as deputy to the Prime Minister's hostage coordinator for the MIAs, bringing to the table his experience in numerous successful hostage negotiations confronting Hezbollah. Thank you so much for joining us, Avi. Whoops, have I lost everybody?
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay, excellent. So we're going to start with a short briefing of the week, just to update where we are from this past week. So this week, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was in Israel pressing for more limited operations. He also made an unannounced visit to the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier yesterday to meet with sailors who were in the Mediterranean to defend Israel in case of increased hostilities. The Defense Secretary also announced a new international maritime mission to protect commercial vessels in the Red Sea. The U.S. was joined by several other nations in this announcement. This week, we also had the fallout from the tragic news that IDF soldiers had killed 3 hostages who had escaped and were trying to make their way to an IDF base. The IDF has confirmed that these soldiers were violating Israel's rules of engagement. The soldiers were, of course, waving white flags. They were shirtless to try to show that they were unarmed. And they had spelled out their condition in flags that they held up and signs that they held up made from food that they had. Following this announcement, there were massive demonstrations in Israel during the week after the killings, and that has put renewed pressure on the Netanyahu government. Meanwhile, there is an attempt to renew negotiations to enable both a ceasefire and further release of hostages. Reporting has it most recently that Israel has proposed a 1-week ceasefire in exchange for 40 hostages. Hamas has reportedly rejected this proposal and is insisting on an unconditional ceasefire before any hostages are released. Numbers with regard to how many hostages remain alive appear to differ. The New York Times and other sources continue to report that there are 130 hostages still alive, but this week Israel declared that there are 25 hostages that have been killed based on bodies that have been discovered in Gaza. The true figure may be unknown, but perhaps Avi can help us with that. So Avi, can you update us on your understanding of the current condition of the hostages? How many are likely still alive? And then, of course, give us your understanding of the state of play of current negotiations.
Yeah, so thanks Claire for the introduction and for the opportunity. I would say that with regard to the hostages itself, we're talking about around, as you mentioned, 130 missing personnel yet, but the Israeli authorities, based on intelligence, that's first, and second, on the evidence that's been found on ground based on the Israeli invasion or the maneuver ground that the IDF conducting currently in Gaza Strip, are talking about dozens of them that are being held as dead. Actually, most of them been murdered by Hamas based on the intelligence assessments, and others were killed by the severe and very unhuman situation. They've been held in captivity that caused to their deaths. Just to remind, most of them, we've got some vulnerable hostages among the population there that have been held, such as elderlies, sick people, women, etc. As with regard to the negotiation situation, it doesn't look so optimistic. President Biden was referring to it just yesterday, saying that it will take some time, this stage, after the most relatively easy stage that we had in the first part of the operation of the war, actually, where over 100 prisoners hostages been released. But currently, it seems that the situation is kind of a halt in a way. Hamas is insisting, as you mentioned, Claire, is insisting on a permanent ceasefire from his side, and Israel is insisting for a negotiating under fire, where the mediators are still in between, has their own challenges in trying to implement some more, I would say, rational, in Western terms, obviously, rational perspective for Hamas leadership to handle more moderate, I would say, standings towards the negotiation.
So the current state of play, is it a complete standoff, it looks like, or do we expect that there is some room for negotiation around a ceasefire coming as part of a hostage release deal? Because I assume that the Israelis will never agree to an unconditional ceasefire without having an agreement with regard to hostage release.
Obviously, hence the situation is that the parties need to focus whether, as we call it, on negotiation methodology, whether it will be out of the room or in the room. The efforts are now to bring the players into the room before discussing even the conditions or the aspects of such an agreement will be achieved at the end. So now the main effort is to bring Hamas into the room, and that's where Egyptians and Qataris should play a major role, more than other players regionally and globally.
So do you mean into the room with Israelis?
Obviously not with Israelis, because we cannot speak to Hamas directly, as I've been, engaging Hamas through third parties for over a decade. But we could say back to back, for example, meetings in in different buildings in Cairo, in other places in the Middle East. We've done it before with Hamas, for example, in the Shalit deal back in 2011. So we know how to work those issues, but we need the consent of both sides to arrange those, and obviously to arrange the needed security measurements, because Hamas leadership is currently kind of concerned by the opportunity, by the option that the IDF might assassinate them.
And just to be clear about the state of the hostages themselves as we understand it. So the 25 dead that were announced, were they identified by name? Were the particular bodies that were found in Gaza, have they been returned to Israel?
Some of the bodies, first of all, they've all been verified by name and been informed first for the families before, getting it to the public knowledge. That's first. Second of all, most of the bodies been returned, but some of them the families been informed that the dearest ones are been killed in Gaza, and the body is still in captivity. We have also some soldiers, senior officers, like head of brigade, colonel reserve that was killed in the 7th October massacre, in the very first day of this war. And his body is still in captivity, is held by Hamas.
So news outlets that are reporting 130 remaining live hostages are not correct, because they're not taking into account these 25 dead, I take it.
Exactly. But I guess the media, at least here, the public in Israel, understands that we have something like 100 alive, or even less than that. As every day that passes obviously puts them in greater risk and danger, and not talking about, mental situation or their health conditions, medicines, etc.
Ambassador Limbert, so you were held for 14 months in captivity in Iran. I gather not all of it at the embassy. Can you describe first for us, and I'm sure you've talked about this many times, but that first moment when the embassy was overrun, what you were thinking, what the experience was like, and whether or not you were in fear for your life at that moment?
Thank you, Claire. And first of all, I mean, what happened to us, as difficult as it was, is nothing compared to what's going on now. Situation which is so much more violent and so much more dangerous. But that being said, yes, the first hours and maybe the first 24 hours, I was terrified. I didn't know whether we were going to come out of this alive. And I think the most terrifying moment was, one of the most terrifying moments was actually the second day, when we were tied up inside the embassy. And outside, there were demonstrations going on, and it sounded like there were hundreds of thousands of people out there chanting slogans. And there we were inside, and I'm thinking, if those people break into the embassy, we're dead, gone. And there had been precedent for that. That had happened earlier. There had been a long time before, maybe 150 years earlier, but a mob had overrun the Russian embassy in the 19th century and killed everyone they found. It didn't help that at the same time this mob was outside, we were tied up inside. Over the radio was playing this incredible music, the Henry Purcell's funeral music for Queen Mary, which you may have recognized. Some of you may remember from A Clockwork Orange. It was used there. That was not the best background for what was going on. But to answer your question briefly, yes, terrified at the beginning. On the other hand, we had some training for this eventuality. I mean, it's hard to say what can prepare you, but one of the things they told us was, if you're still alive 48 hours after you're captured, at that point, your chances of getting out alive improve. That does not, of course, say when.
So you have mentioned that while you were held for 14 months, it was not all at the embassy. You've also mentioned that for 9 of those months you were held in solitary confinement. Where were you held? And I gather you were moved around a little bit. Can you describe that?
We were captured in November of 1979. In April of 1980, U.S. attempted a rescue mission, very brave attempt, but which failed, which as we know
Famously failed. Yeah.
And after that, we were moved around. We were moved around the country. I was one of some people who ended up in Isfahan, right, about 300 kilometers south of Tehran. I attempted to send a coded message in one of my letters home, a few letters home that I could write, saying where I was. I used a very simple code involving the first letters of some words. When my wife saw this, she knew there was something wrong in this message, and so she showed it to CIA and NSA colleagues, and they couldn't figure it out. It was, I think, too simple for them to figure it out. But then in August of 80, we came back to Tehran, but we never went back. We never went back to the embassy. We were held at Evin prison for a while. We were held at the infamous Comité prison in the Shah, which had been the Shah's political prison downtown, and that was the time when when the Iran-Iraq War started, and we were right on the flight path of a lot of aircraft at that time.
So these conditions were obviously very different, and you've described from the condition that current hostages are being held in Gaza. In particular, you were held above ground the entire time. Avi, can you describe what we believe to be the conditions of the hostages currently, based on reports of people who have been coming out, and how in general they've been treated and what their experience has been?
Mhm. Well, if the very first day of the war, there were kind of in a way, somewhat optimistic perspective in Israel with regard to the situation of the hostages and where they're being held. So obviously, once we've been revealed to the evidence of all the hostages that have been released after 3 to 4 weeks, or almost one month and a half afterwards, 6 weeks afterwards, we've got to really understand the bad conditions that they were held in. Obviously, they've been starved in a way, or the situation in Gaza is in any way not that good, but they've been starved, they've been tortured. Some of the kids, for example, been held alone, aside from their mothers. And we're talking about small kids, yes, less than 10 years old. We know that some of the kids been forced to watch the torture or the massacre films of the October 7th, obviously causing them serious mental problems. Some of them been tortured personally, and obviously the main concern is about the women, where we understand that some of them been raped, also in captivity, and some of them are still being held. And that was one of the reasons why the negotiation at first was a kind of a stop or been actually explode, because Israel couldn't understand or couldn't get the position of Hamas for not releasing the young women from captivity and waiting for it, hopefully for the next stage, if any at all. We have deep concerns in Israel, in particular for this part of the hostages, this population, this group within the hostages group, within the hostages team as a whole, as we talk about the young women, and grave concerns about them here in Israel.
So I'd like to now bring in Ido Dan, who is a former intel officer with the IDF, and he is currently CEO at MVP Shams Incorporated, which does strategic coaching for companies and government. But he's here with us today because he is a relative and a member of the Calderon family, 5 of whose members were abducted. The two young boys, Sahar and Erev, have recently been released from captivity, but tragically, two of the members of the family, Carmela and Noya, were murdered by Hamas. Welcome, Ido. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you describe to us the condition of the boys and how they're doing, whether or not they've been able to talk at all about their ordeal?
So, first of all, thank you for having me, Claire. So basically, Sahar, she's 16 years old, and Erez turned 12 while being in Gaza. And when they got back, we of course were very, very happy, and we're extremely surprised about their surprisingly well condition. And we, because we heard many stories of other kids in captivity that were near torturing. And if we talk about, emotional torturing, so it was full blown there, including like, exposing them to videos from the massacre, scaring them that there is no more Israel and there was nowhere to return. They didn't know back then that the mother is alive. They thought that Hadass, their mother, is actually dead, because they were taken with their father, Ofer, who is still hostage, even after their release. And so we felt extremely lucky that they came back, at least physically. They were pale, they were much thinner. The eyes were a little bit off, turned off a little bit, but they seemed fine. And then probably about a week and a half later, some of the trauma started to surface up. And there are many strange behaviors. For example, they walked in the streets after a week in Tel Aviv. They have like a temporary apartment in Tel Aviv, and they went down after a few days, almost a week, with the mother, and there was a homeless that turned to Hadass, their mother, and say, "Oh, I saw you on TV. You are the mother of the hostage kids." And by the time she responded to him, she realized that Erez is not around her, and the 12 years old, and Sahar was actually hiding behind her. She's 16 years old. She's a grown-up girl, and she hid behind her, and she felt her nails like stuck in her belly, even though she wore a sweater. So it took like 5 minutes to find Erez. He was hiding in one of the buildings around, because he was so scared just from this homeless person. So and then they're afraid of the dark. They wake up several times a night and go to the door and make sure they lock it, and then they come back, and then maybe 2 minutes later they go back to the door and lock it again. They're scared from any noise. They jump, like if there's a noise down the street by a truck or something, or garbage trucks, they get nervous. And there are many things that so basically we're just starting to understand what it will take to rehabilitate them. It's going to be very, very challenging. And to be quite honest, we're not sure what's there exactly, because one of the instructions that we got from experts is actually not to interrogate them, to let them bring things, in their own pace. But their own pace means that they won't bring up, the traumas. They bring up tiny stuff, stories like that. But also we realize, and also, by the way, the Secret Service integrated them. And this is a very interesting point, because the service doesn't have any experience interrogating, kids in this age. And they went through special training to do so. And that was very, very appreciated. But it took, I think, between 3 to 4 hours, the first interrogation for each one of them. And and even if they probably did very, very, with a lot of sensitivity. After these sessions, they were very, very upset. Kids, very upset. It seems like almost they went like a week back, and they were just released again from captivity. So we are very, very happy, and we feel fortunate that they are here. But they're not the same kids. They seem like maybe 20, 30 years older. And we're going to do all we can. We're going to consult with the best experts of how to, to bring them to normality and bring them back to life. But the
And
problem
just before I bring in our next guest, who in fact is extremely knowledgeable about these issues, can you just tell us what you know, what you were told about the tragic murder of Carmela and Noya? You found out about this roughly in the middle of October, so I take it happened very early on, or did it happen? We believe on October 7th.
No, actually, what happens is that 5 of the family members, my aunt Carmela was 80, and then 3 of her grandchildren, and Ofer, who is the father of 2 of them, of Sarah and Erez, and 2 weeks later, around 2 weeks later, and maybe 7 hours after we celebrated their 80th birthday, Carmela's 80th birthday, in her absence, the military officer knocked on her daughter's door and told her that both her mother, Carmela, and Noya, her daughter, which was on the autistic spectrum, were brutally murdered. And they found in a military operation of the special forces across the border. So they were already in Gaza, but we don't know exactly yet the reason for their death, the exact reason. So yeah, I mean, and one thing I do want to, because we don't have much time, I do want to point out is that President Biden, surprisingly enough, was the first head of country who met with us personally, and we met with him several times since. And he was pivotal in making this deal for hostage release possible. And then we had actually a regular interactions and Zooms, basically, with Roger Carstens, who is the head of CIFA. And it was extremely, extremely important because we have, at that time, our prime minister didn't even meet with the hostage families. And the same thing happened a week later with the French President Macron, because we are also French citizens. So American citizens, French citizens, and Israeli citizens. So we got like 3 fronts of diplomatic resources to work with. And surprisingly enough, and I'm not sure that surprising is the right adjective to use, we discovered that the most challenging front or channel is actually the domestic one. Because not only Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has political challenges with the price that's likely the country will have to pay in terms of prisoners, murderers. I'm not talking about the regular prisoners, but the hardcore prisoners. Right. And his assumption is that if he goes for such a deal, he won't be able to survive, or his government won't be able to survive. So this is the one huge challenge that we're having right now, following Avi's comments, because I think that this is it becomes more prominent every day. This is the issue domestically. And on top of that, we have the issue that started on October 8th with the objectives of the war. And the objectives were conflicting to the annihilation of the Hamas and releasing the hostage, actually the second priority. And this is conflicting, as we can see, again, what Avi described with the three hostages that got killed, and so on.
That's right, and there's enormous anger towards the Netanyahu government, we gather, by some of the families of the hostages. If we could now bring in Dr. Steve Xenakis. Steve Xenakis is an adult, child, and adolescent psychiatrist with many years of clinical, academic, and management experience. He retired from the U.S. Army in 1998 at the rank of Brigadier General and began an active career starting up medical technology companies in clinical practice. He has advised the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other senior Department of Defense officials on psychological health and the effects of blast concussion. He is actively engaged with Physicians for Human Rights and Human Rights First. He is the only retired military general and physician to speak out publicly against torture and the involvement of healthcare practitioners in torture. He is also on the medical advisory board for Centers for Victims of Torture, and he has traveled to Israel on multiple trips to advise the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. He is also, I'm proud to say, a executive board member of our center, the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure that you have many reactions to what you've heard Ido Dan talk about with this family. Tell us your experience in dealing, especially as an expert in child and adolescent psychiatry, and what you imagine their path to recovery will be.
Well, thanks, Claire. It's my sympathies and heart go out to everyone, all the families and men and women and children who have been caught up in this conflict, and to hear these stories are just sobering, and certainly reminds us of what can happen in this kind of chaos and how tragic it is for the citizens and all the individuals who are caught up in this. I think that when we look at this and see what needs to be done as military healthcare people, we realize that any approach is very individualized. You've got, as we've heard, different stories from Mr. Dan, from Ambassador Limbert. We have individuals that have their own backgrounds and resilience and certainly vulnerabilities and in these kinds of situations. Fortunately, we know that also that Israel has a very dedicated and committed professionals that are doing everything they can to help these families and help the survivors of the hostages. But it's extremely challenging, extremely challenging, because in fact, the way to assist and support these individuals, the children particularly, as well as adults, has to be so individualized, and it takes time. Interesting the way Mr. Dan was saying about the initial reaction. Everybody sort of seemed, oh, it's going to be okay, and then things started to unfold. Well, that in fact is an old story. We discovered that in the U.S., and I was involved in the West Coast from in a kidnapping and actually the burial of a bus in Chowchilla in 1977. And it took a year, 2 years afterwards, where a child psychiatrist started to collect the stories of how this was unfolding for these children, and misbehavior, interpersonal conflict, families fighting with each other, divorce, all sorts of circumstances that had not been considered. And we know that over time, that's what happens, that people have something very traumatic, as Ambassador Limbert said. They're terrified at the moment that the events occurred. Cannot predict what's going to happen, don't know how it's going to unfold. They're desperate. They grab for straws. They want anything that's going to make them feel comfort, and it's hard to process. It can take, in fact, it's probably imprinted and embedded in their minds for the rest of their lives. It will clearly shape how their lives unfold. Interestingly, in some ways, there's some growth from that for some people. But we also know that those memories are there. And most importantly, that the experience is transmitted from one generation to the next.
Yeah,
It
and in many
really-
cases, Steve, if you could talk about this, some of these families are also Holocaust survivor families. And
Right.
so they're already dealing with the impact of intergenerational trauma. And then when you add these experiences, you've got a sort of, multi-dimensional countrywide trauma. And there is, of course, extensive trauma on the other side as well. So I wonder if you could talk about some of the more, widespread and sociological, political ramifications of this.
Well, we know that when we look at the clusters, it's not just the quote unquote identified patient, it's the cluster around them, the family and the community and other people. So it has a broad impact. But perhaps I can explain it in terms of imagine trying to do family therapy. You imagine having a 12-year-old trying to process what happened. And then you have a grandparent who has been affected by the Holocaust, still processing that experience. And then you have the children, the parents of that 12-year-old that are their whole lives have been informed one way or another about those experiences that the victims of the Holocaust had and the rest of the family. Everyone's immersed in this, for lack of a better word, muck. And of course, it's human nature, but it says, well, I know how to handle this. But what my person may think it can handle it doesn't fit with another person. It's very nuanced and it requires dedicated people. It requires time and attention, and it's a lifetime endeavor.
Yeah.
So this has a profound impact on both the social and political landscape of this country, of this region.
I want to go back to Avi Kalo for a minute, and let me remind members of the audience, you can start putting your questions in the Q&A. We'll be turning to those pretty soon. But Avi, if you could, I'd like to ask you to pick up on something that Ido Dan said, which is that the most frustrating part of this has been the domestic part. That was very striking to me, and the amount of support that he's gotten from the U.S. and from the French, and the fact that the hostages have been second in priority for the government, with first priority being to wipe out Hamas, to of course, with that meaning to incapacitate their military capabilities. Has the government had the right priority here? And how do you think about those different priorities when at times they may be conflicting? And of course, we see one way dramatically in which those priorities conflicted just this past week with the shooting of 3 of the hostages.
Yeah. So without getting into too much deep politics in Israel, that's a different debate that we can engage, obviously. Yeah. The main tension probably is between the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, unique situation is legal, he has a holding criminal procedures, and the need to survive is a harsh wing right coalition that does not agree to release heavy, I would say, or substantial security prisoners, Palestinian ones that are murderers, etc., that are supposed to be probably released in the next future, movements for the releasing of additional hostages. That's first. But on the other hand, there is the aspects of and the interests of Israeli national security, whereas we cannot, generally speaking, release, a genuine amount or empty our prisons for any Palestinian security prisoners, because it's a very delicate situation here, in the West Bank and in Gaza, and the aftermath of the war. There will be some delicate security situation on ground. So it's a very delicate situation, yet there is a bandwidth where the government can play a role and the cabinet can play a role and be more flexible in those regards. The issue is that the political situation of Prime Minister is really narrowing the possibilities for the government of Israel, and that's part of the tragedy that we are, confronting currently with regard to the hostages.
Yeah, and do you think that the government's priorities are beginning to shift? I mean, after this tragic event and with the anger that's being manifested and the incredible support among the Israeli people that that the hostage families are receiving as time is running out for them, given the harsh conditions that they're being held in. Do you think that the Netanyahu government is starting to shift their priorities, or at least underscoring, putting more urgency on the need to get negotiations going again?
Well, on ground, we do see more substantial efforts from the side of the government. For example, the head of Mossad, the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Agency, as it was published, was traveling to Doha, was traveling to Europe. In some cases, he was meeting also the head of the CIA, William Burns,
Right.
and the head of and some Qatari officials and Egyptians, and they worked together in order to make kind of equation that is possible for Hamas to receive. But as I mentioned earlier, the main challenge is to bring Hamas into the room. And currently, Hamas is looking first and foremost for its survivability before putting the prisoners as first priority, meaning the organization, the murderous organization, is focused on its survivability because Israel set the objective of demolishing the organization during this war. So that would be the first condition, at least for now, in Hamas perspective for furthering negotiation between parties in order to release some of the hostages, at least at the first stage.
Let me get Steve Xenakis.
Yeah, so Claire, I'd like to, I defer to the experts on the social political factors, but as a military physician and as someone who feels strongly that the strength, the vitality of a country is in the health and welfare and the mental health as well of its people. It unfortunately sometimes that falls through the cracks. And the consideration, and that's what we've been trying to write about. We published this volume, as you know, in Oxford University Press on preventing the invisible wounds and injuries, how important it is to bring out and to spotlight the health of the people. And we, in this situation, in talking about the political landscape, which I defer to your other experts, set and setting, as we talk about it, is very, very important. The sense that if for people to heal, the sense that they can live their lives with some sense of productivity, with some sense of assurance, means that they have to feel secure. They have to know that things are taken care of, and they can, in fact, continue to try and get the right, and have a spirit that they know is positive, and that they can have relationships. So it's vitally important that everyone understand that there need to be programs and policies in order to stabilize that set and setting and for everyone to feel secure.
Yeah. Okay, let me get Ambassador Limbert in, and then I'm going to go to the Q&A.
Thank you. Let me join in saying to Ido and their families how difficult this is, and how tragic it all is. We all hope for some resolution. You don't see an easy answer, obviously. But I can speak as someone who is on the inside, and I think speaking as someone who is on the inside, and also I think for many of the families in a situation like this, all of these political considerations and security considerations, all of these things, frankly, I couldn't have cared less about them. I had one priority, and that was, I want out of here. And in our case, what it took, I couldn't have cared less. If they wanted $28 billion in the Shah's property, or what they said, that was fine with me. That sounded reasonable to me. If they wanted aircraft carts, that was reasonable. They wanted the Shah back, which they said they did. That was okay. What did the Shah ever do for me? I mean, I would have thrown Henry Kissinger in the bargain into the mix if they wanted. So all of these political things, and they're right. I mean, Ido and Avi are perfectly right. And it was the same for President Carter, who basically sacrificed his presidency because of his prioritizing our lives But none, I mean, again, the priority for us and for our families was to get us out, and those other things were definitely secondary.
All right, let me go to the Q&A now. We have a first question from Eilert Rosen. After Hamas took control of Gaza, Egypt took drastic measures to keep Hamas and all Gazans out of Egypt and locked into Gaza. They raised a city on their side of the border, displaced 70,000 Egyptians, built a wall that extends 17 feet underground to block tunnels, and created a mile-wide buffer zone. Is Egypt now breaking international law by denying entry to Gazan refugees who seek temporary safety from a war zone and will return when it's safe? Maybe, Avi, you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, without getting into the the issue itself, because I'm not aware of all the details of it, and personally not familiar with this story, but obviously we can engage a different discussion, more particular about the international law, I would say, obligations of a country when refugees are knocking the doors at the borders, and that could be relevant also for US Mexico or for other places where we know some relative cases or examples. I would say, generally speaking, that the Egyptians are sovereign for the state, and they does not have any, I would say, substantial obligations by international law that sets them for the obligation to open the doors for those refugees. They do need to support, they do need to handle in accordance to international humanitarian law in this regard. And obviously also to set some support for the international organizations that are involved in Gaza, like the ICRC, UNRWA, the UN agencies and others that are involved, mainly in the southern part of Gaza, where most refugees been evacuated into in the orders of the IDF when the invasion after October 7th has started.
All right, and we have another, one thing on the Egyptian point, just before I go to the next question, Avi. You've talked about their role now a little bit in being part of the negotiations. Can you just say a little bit more about that, what role they're playing in the negotiations and how hard they're prepared now to press Hamas?
Yeah, when we're talking about the Egyptians, they enjoy traditionally a strong position in Gaza Strip, both because of its geographical proximity. It should be remembered that the southern crossing of Gaza Strip is the Rafah crossing under the Egyptian control in the Sinai Peninsula. Therefore, the Egyptians, in their aggressive way, familiar also to me personally, because I was working with them for more than a decade in intensive engagements in Cairo and other places where I took part, I know how they influence Hamas as well. There is a close ties between senior figures in the Egyptian general intelligence apparatus, headed by Abbas Kamel, who is a former army officer and a close relative to the President Sisi, and the Hamas leadership on the basis of personal acquaintances between parties, direct connection, interpersonal relations, in the context that really enables advancement of move, as well as the presence on ground as facilitator, as we've seen them facilitating actually the first deal that was conducting on ground in the last, a month ago, actually. So it was under the Egyptian jurisdiction and leading on field. So they have a substantial role. And they are also been in close ties, obviously, with the US as a main ally. So that brings lots of value into the process.
Oh, that's excellent. Is it safe to assume that at some point, this is from, Wayne Shaw, is it safe to assume at some point, once Hamas has been eliminated or surrendered, that there will be some sort of October 7th commission to figure out what intelligence, border security, military, or other changes need to be made so that this murderous tragedy never happens again? And will there be growth in EO/IR sensors along the border? And then, Avi, that's got to be for you as well.
Yeah, no, I'll just speak about the first part of it. Obviously, there are some people who really make the relevance of the accident of the massacre of October 7th as equivalent to 9/11 in Israeli terms. So obviously there will be an investigation, independent one, set by the government, but obviously once it gets into the way, it's like it was after the 9/11 committee based on the Congress decision. So now it will be the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that will set the law for this investigation. That will be a thorough one and very, I believe, aggressive in regard to understanding the fundamentals of this failure, epic failure, not only with regard to intelligence, but also with regard to operational standing on the border, the posture of defense along the borders, etc. It will be a massive one. I can say for myself that I've been published an article last week in the leading newspaper in Israel calling for the establishment of the Israeli DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, as one of the lessons of 9/11. Hopefully, we will see some different, maybe some different, but similar developments that will take care in Israel post the October War.
And in fact, there are a lot of lessons that the U.S. is only just beginning to learn about what we did post 9/11 that we need to continue to learn, and we hope that Israel may take a leaf from our book. From Nancy Sherman, and this I will pitch this question to Ido. Can you give us a sense from what you know of whether there was ever a kind of internal organization, a group coalition, or a kind of chain of command within the hostage group, or also relating to that, were they largely isolated from one another, or were they able to communicate and work together?
Yeah. So without violating any confidentiality and secrets, because there's a lot of sensitivity around the information that we get. I can say that maybe the things I can say is that they were scattered into groups, and some of them were isolated as well. For example, Erez. Okay, Erez from my family, the 12 years old. In the first 16 days, he was alone, totally alone, without even a guard. He was locked in a room like in a jail cage, and he was then moved to a family, and from that point on, he was actually treated very well, because he was he used his humor and wits, and he performed to this family on a weekly basis. And the head of the family was an English teacher, and he taught him English and Arabic. So this is pretty amazing, because this is most likely because, I mean, those are, it gives me goosebumps, because those are Holocaust stories, like exactly that this one kid, took up, the brim and just cleaned on the way to the to the killing zone, and then the Germans just say, oh, he's useful, then let's take him. Stuff like that. But just back to the question. So there were groups. We don't know of any kind of chain of command or any rebellion or stuff like that. But we do know that, interestingly enough, the three hostages that were mistakenly killed by the Israeli military, their guards were killed by the military, and then they decided to take an initiative, and they thought very, very wisely of how and carefully of how they'll appear to the Israeli military, and they went out maybe 2 or 3 days earlier with a piece of cloth, and they wrote with a spice, with like orangish reddish spice. They wrote in Hebrew SOS, and there are 3 kidnapped boys here. But then when they went out, there was one guy who was leading this effort, and he instructed the other 2 how to do it, and to take basically the clothes off, because they heard that the military is afraid. They heard in Hebrew, the military soldiers are afraid of suicide bombers. So they took their shirts off, and basically the most devastating part of this story is they did all they can to explain that they are harmless and that they are hostages. But unfortunately, it didn't work out for them. And this is very, very sad. So
There-
to summarize, I don't think we have any sign or evidence for rebellion or any, grouping or chain of command. But maybe there will be, because we have to remember that until that moment, the weaker category of hostages were released. So we don't know what's going on with the most stronger one, which are the soldiers and the men. And over there, the more, higher chances that maybe that will happen as well.
There was new reporting that I saw this morning that one of the hostages that was shot, the commander of the IDF soldier who shot, had told him to hold his fire. I
That's
believe
true.
the third
That's
person
true.
who was
He
shot,
did. The
which is
brigade, yeah, he did.
really, really extraordinary as this investigation unfolds. I'm impressed by the swiftness and also the transparency, frankly, with which these details are
Yeah,
coming
but
out.
we have to remember that seriously, with all the pain of saying what I'm about to say, this was illegal shooting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay? So I know it's hard to judge the soldiers, but it was against the rules of engagement. It was against international law. It was, and it's not the code of conduct, because we all served in the military. Me and Avi, we know this is not the code of conduct, and this needs to be investigated. And I'm sure there'll be reasons, and explanations of what happened there. But overall, this shouldn't have happened, and it should not happen in the future. And I'm very, very glad that the chief of the military, kind of crystallized and updated the rules of engagement, so it's clear that you don't shoot innocent, or at least people without any arms and with a white flag,
And hopefully this will get inculcated throughout the IDF in the wake of this incident to a much greater degree. Ambassador Limbert.
Yeah, just a quick comment. It's obvious that these three escape knew how dangerous the situation was. And when I served in Baghdad in 2003 with the State Department contingent, right after the our forces that occupy the city. And one of the things they told us was the most dangerous thing for you is not Iraqi enemy. It's a 18, 19-year-old American GI who hasn't slept or eaten properly and is terrified, sitting there with his M16. And that is the most dangerous thing. That's what you should be scared of. That's what we were. In terms of a chain of command, I can say, we were isolated from each, some in groups, some like myself, alone. And that was one of the hardest things, to not have any contact. And I did everything I could to make contact with others, find out. But there were long stretches when I did not have contact, and it got difficult because there were times when I thought, am I the last one? Is everybody gone? Is everybody else dead? And I didn't know. And your mind begins to play tricks with you. And call it chain of command, but call it contact, is absolutely vital.
Well, we have run out of time. I can't thank you enough for coming on today, all of you. I hope you'll be available to join us again. We're very grateful for your expertise, and Ido Dan for sharing your personal crisis of your family. And we wish the youngest members of your family who have been released safety and recovery, and of course the release of Offer, who's still in captivity. Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks to our audience for joining us. And we will see you again after the new year. And I turn it back to Dave Johnson.
Yes, I echo what Claire said. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. The event recording will be available on Searle's YouTube channel shortly. This event series will resume in January. Please stay tuned for a lineup of speakers. And Searle is wishing you all a healthy and restful holiday season. Good afternoon.